She smelled the ranch before she saw the house. Cut hay drying in the low field, and under it, faint, wood smoke holding steady. A steady fire meant the kitchen hadn't been abandoned. The rest could wait. Hannah Pike counted as she walked the last stretch of wagon road, the way she'd counted rooms and mouths for 6 years without meaning to anymore. A bunkhouse built for 6, fresh lumber patched onto one end for more. Wash hung on a line too long for one household. A garden gone to weed at the edges, planted right, then left short of hands. Enough cattle spread across the near pasture that feed mattered more than paint. An axe struck wood somewhere behind the barn, steady, 3 counts apart. She was still 40 yards off when she saw, through the open kitchen window, a heavy-set older woman setting a stock pot down with both hands. Hands that shook hard enough to slop water over the rim. The woman turned her back to the window the second after, quick, like she didn't want it seen. Hannah had seen it. Boots came along the fence line toward her before she reached the yard. She stopped at a respectful distance and didn't waste his time. "I'm looking for kitchen work." He looked her over. Dust on the hem of her dress, boots worn honest, no ring, no husband trailing behind with a wagon. He hadn't been looking to hire. He said so. "Where'd you cook before?" "Boarding house in Rollins. Track crew. 25 men, sometimes 30. That's a lot more than 10. 25 men on a foreman's budget. 10 eating regular is easier." "Why'd you leave it?" "House closed. Crew moved on to Green River." He turned that over a moment. It was a plain enough answer, and plain answers were easier to trust than good ones. "I heard you've got 10 men coming on for the shipping drive." He didn't ask how she knew. He glanced back toward the house, toward the window, though the woman was out of sight of it now, and was quiet a while longer than the question called for. "I can hire you through the shipping," he said finally. "Not past it. I don't know yet what I'll have to pay anybody once the cattle are sold and the bank in Omaha's had its cut. Might be I keep 2 hands through winter. Might be I keep none. I won't tell you different than that." "That's fair enough. Store account stays where it's at now, not more. 10 men eat plain, but they eat enough, and they eat on time. That's the whole of it." She nodded once, like he'd handed her a list she already knew by heart. The woman from the window met her at the kitchen door, flour still on her forearms, a look on her face somewhere between relief and an old grief loosening its grip. "You'll want the good knife," she said, already turning back to the stove, her hand steadier now with something to hold. "The other one won't keep an edge." "Thank you." "Name?" "Hannah." From the doorway to the hall, a girl stood with one shoulder against the frame, watching the way children watch something they haven't decided about yet. Hannah didn't crouch down to her, didn't ask her name. She crossed the kitchen, set a small clay jar on the shelf above the flour bin, and rested her hand on the lid a heartbeat before she let go. The girl watched the jar a moment longer than she'd watched Hannah. Then she went back to shelling peas at the table and didn't tell anyone what she'd decided. The letter came on a Tuesday, same as it always did, carried up from Fenner by whoever happened to be riding that way. Corwin read it standing at the corral fence and didn't say what was in it, and nobody asked. Hannah watched him fold it back along its old creases and put it inside his coat instead of burning it, which was what men did with letters they meant to look at again. She didn't ask either. It wasn't her business yet, and she had a stove to learn. The stove was a good one, cast iron, well-seated, but it had been fed wrong for years. Too much green wood, not enough draft, and it took her the better part of a morning just to get the heat to sit even across the top instead of scorching one side and leaving the other lukewarm. Sigrid showed her where things were kept without being asked twice. The flour bin, the root cellar door, swollen shut with damp and needing a hard shoulder to open. The tin where the coffee was kept, half empty, with a note of the price written inside the lid in a hand that wasn't Sigrid's. Corwin's, most likely, keeping track of what things cost the way some men kept track of rainfall. Hannah looked at that number for a while. She had a way of stretching coffee that had served her well in Rollins, where the foreman docked her a day's pay if the account ran over. Dandelion root, dug and dried and roasted dark, cut in even with the real grounds. It tasted rougher, but it stretched a pound of coffee near twice as far. and nobody at a boarding house table had ever complained enough to matter. She tried it on the ranch hands the second morning. Rafe Dowd was the first man through the door, same as every morning, and he took his cup standing at the threshold the way he always did, and he drank half of it before his face changed. He didn't say anything at first. He looked into the cup like it had done something to him personally. Then he walked to the porch rail and poured the rest of it out into the dirt, slow and deliberate, so there'd be no mistaking it for an accident. "That ain't coffee," he said, not unkindly, just flat, the way a man states a fact about weather. "Whatever that is." Nobody else said a word, but nobody finished their cup either, and two men left theirs on the table half full, which was its own kind of answer. Hannah didn't argue it. She poured the pot out after breakfast, made a fresh one with the coffee alone, full strength, and didn't try the root again. She understood something about it she hadn't fully understood in Rollins, where the men drinking her coffee had been paying customers with somewhere else to eat if they didn't like it. These men had nowhere else. The coffee wasn't an expense to them. It was one of the only things in a 14-hour day that was entirely theirs, and she'd tried to take a piece of it without knowing that was what she was doing. She didn't say any of that out loud either. She just made it strong from then on and let the tin run down faster than she liked, and looked for what else could be trimmed instead. The second the steak was smaller and took longer to notice. She'd cooked to a boarding house clock in Rollins, supper at 6, sharp, because the crew came off shift together and ate together, and that was that. The Sayers' hands didn't work that way. Haying ran until the light gave out, which some evenings was 7 and some was closer to 8. And the men who came in early hung around the yard hungry and short-tempered while she held the pans back, waiting on the rest. And the men who came in late found their food gone cold and sat eating it anyway without complaint, which was worse than complaining. Sigrid was the one who told her, not unkindly. "They don't come in together here," she said. "Feed the first ones when they come. Keep the rest warm on the back of the stove. They don't mind waiting on a hot plate. They mind waiting on their supper." Hannah adjusted the next day, and the day after that it ran smooth, and nobody mentioned it again because there was nothing left to mention. Mel came into the kitchen the way she seemed to do most things, quietly, from the edge of a room, watching before deciding whether she'd stay. She'd been sitting on the same stool for 3 days, pushed back against the wall near the pie safe, out of the way of feet and pots and the swing of the oven door. Sigrid had set her there years ago, Hannah gathered, the only spot in a working kitchen where a small child could sit and still be watched without being underfoot, because there was only one woman minding both a girl and a stove, and a woman with 2 things to mind couldn't spare a hand for a third. Hannah didn't ask her to help. She didn't crouch down and coax her closer either. She just went on rolling out dough at the table, and once, without making anything of it, pulled the stool out a few inches, near enough that a child leaning forward could reach the table's edge, if she wanted to. Nell looked at the gap for a long moment before she got down and crossed it. She didn't ask permission. She put both hands flat on the table like she was waiting to be told what they were for, and Hannah gave her a scrap of dough, no bigger than an egg, and went back to her own piece without watching to see what the girl did with it. The peas went slower than they should have most days after that. Beans got spilled and had to be picked up off the floor one at a time. A crock of milk went over once, and Hannah wiped it up herself before Sigrid saw, and started the morning's work over a half-hour behind where she needed to be to have supper ready on time. Nobody in the house ever knew what it cost her to let the girl stay. She never once said. Sigrid noticed the flour on Nell's pinafore before she noticed anything else, and stood in the doorway with her hands on her hips for a moment that could have gone either way. Then she said, "Wash before you touch the peas," to Nell, not to Hannah, and went back to her ironing. It was, as far as anyone in that house ever remarked on it, the whole of the matter. The root cellar smell was the first thing Hannah noticed once she had a free hour to go down and take stock of what she'd actually been left to work with. It hit her on the stairs. Not the clean, cold earth smell a cellar ought to have, but something sourer underneath it. Faint, but wrong. She found the source hanging from the ceiling joists near the potato bins. 3 sides of smoked bacon, gone soft and faintly slick at the edges, sweating in air that never moved. She carried all 3 up into the daylight and laid them on the chopping block, and 2 were still good enough to trim and use quick, and 1 she had to give to the dogs. She found Corwin at the tool shed that evening and didn't waste the visit on apology. "Your cellar's killing your meat," she said. "It wants for air. Smoked meat needs it dry and moving. Root vegetables want it cold and still. You've got both crowded into the same hole in the ground, and the meat's losing. It's kept that way as long as I've had the place." "Then you've been losing meat as long as you've had the place." He didn't answer that right off. He had the look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't enjoy. "What do you want?" 2 vent pipes, 1 low, 1 high, opposite corners so the air has to cross the whole room to get out instead of slipping straight through. Lumber and a day of somebody's time. That's the whole cost. "And it does what?" "Cold air's heavier. It comes in low and pushes the warm, wet air up and out the high pipe on its own. No pump, no fan. Same reason your stovepipe pulls smoke up out of the kitchen instead of it sitting in the room. You've had that answer in your own house the whole time. You just never asked the cellar the same question." He looked toward the kitchen chimney like he was seeing it new. "Meat comes out of there first, then," he said. "Smokehouse or the loft. Root cellars for what grows in the ground." "That's right." He was quiet a moment longer. "If it fails," Hannah said, "take it out of my wages." He didn't answer that at all, but there was lumber stacked by the cellar door the next morning before she'd even come down to start the fire, and nobody had told her it would be there. Sigrid was the one who walked the ground with her before the digging started, pointing with her chin the way she did instead of her hand when both hands were busy. "Not there." She nodded past the proposed spot for the low intake toward the northwest corner of the yard. "Wind sits hard from that way all winter. Snow piles against that wall higher than your waist by January. You'll be digging it out every week to breathe at all." "Where then?" "East side. Snow don't drift there. Barn breaks it." She considered the high vent a moment longer. "And keep it clear of that low spot yonder, by the well. Ground weeps there every spring. Thaw water finds the lowest pipe it can. Put your vent in the weeping ground. You'll be pulling mud instead of air by April." Hannah moved both markers to where Sigrid pointed and didn't ask how she knew. 20 years standing in one yard through every one of its winters was its own kind of ledger, and Hannah had learned to trust a ledger she hadn't kept herself. The pipes went in over 2 days. The first hard rain after settled the question. The cellar came out dry both times Hannah checked it, air moving cool and steady through the low pipe when she held her palm to it. And by the second week, the sour smell was gone entirely, replaced with nothing at all, which was exactly what a root cellar was supposed to smell like. The hay box took longer and cost her a wasted supper before it earned its place. She'd read of the method in a farm paper years back, a stew brought to a hard boil, then wrapped tight and packed into a hay-stuffed crate, left to finish cooking on its own retained heat instead of tending a fire all day. Sigrid remembered the shape of it from somewhere further back than any paper, though she'd never had the wood or the time spared to build one herself, not with a girl to mind and a house to run alone. "Hay has to be dry," Sigrid said, the one thing she was certain of. "Truly dry. Damp hay holds heat wrong, goes sour, sometimes hot enough on its own to worry about. Not what you want next to meat." Hannah packed the first crate with hay pulled from the edge of the stack, close enough to the ground that she hadn't thought to question it. The stew came out 8 hours later, lukewarm and faintly off, the hay gone damp somewhere in the packing, and she scraped the whole pot into the slop bucket rather than serve it and say nothing. The second crate she packed with hay from high in the loft, turned and checked dry with her own hand before it went in. And by evening the pot came out fork tender and steaming, having sat untouched near the stove all day, while she'd spent that same day out at the vents instead of standing over a fire. It was Rafe, of all people, who mentioned it to Corwin, not to Hannah, and not as a compliment, just an observation dropped over evening chores. "Wasn't nobody sent to split kindlin' for the stew pot today," he said. "First time all week." Corwin didn't say anything back, but he glanced toward the kitchen window a while later, the way he'd taken to doing, and didn't look away as quick as he used to. He caught her at the woodshed a few days after, mending a bucket handle with a scrap of harness leather that had no business being used for it. "Who told you to fix that?" "No one." She didn't look up from the leather, threading the awl through with the flat, unhurried patience of someone who'd done the job 100 times before on somebody else's tools. "Cheaper than a trip to town for a new one." He watched her work another moment, then went on toward the barn without saying anything else. It wasn't much of an exchange, but it stayed with him longer than it should have for 2 sentences about a bucket. The evening it happened, Sigrid was teaching Nell to braid a rag rug from scraps at the kitchen table, and the girl was asking, the way she asked most things, without any particular weight behind it, the same tone she'd have used to ask why the sky was blue. "Did my mother know how to do this?" "She did." Sigrid didn't look up from the braid. "Better than me, if I'm honest. Ellen had patient hands." Nell went on braiding, unbothered, the name passing through her the way water passes over a stone that's long since stopped noticing the current. "Is Nell short for something?" "Ellen," Sigrid said. "Your mother's name. You're the little one of it. Nell." "Oh." Nell held up the rug scrap to check her work. "This is crooked. Pull it tighter here." Sigrid reached over to fix it without another word on the matter. Nell had already moved past it, back into the rug, back into the ordinary run of an evening. She would not remember, an hour from now, that the conversation had happened at all. Hannah, standing at the stove with a wooden spoon gone still in her hand, remembered every word of it for a long time after. Sigrid set 3 plates at the long table that same week, same as she'd done without comment since the first day Hannah arrived, moving Hannah's place from the kitchen corner to the family table like it had always belonged there. Corwin came in, saw the 3rd plate, and without a word carried it back to the sideboard before he sat down. He did the same thing the next evening, and the one after. It was the evening after the haybox stew came out right, after Rafe's remark about the kindling, after Corwin had stood a long moment at the kitchen window with his hands on the sill, that Sigrid set the 3rd plate down again, same as always. Corwin looked at it. He didn't move it. He sat and ate and said nothing about it at all. And nobody at that table remarked on the difference between that evening and every evening before it. But the plate stayed where Sigrid had set it, and it stayed there the next night too, and after a while, nobody moved it anywhere ever again. They butchered a young steer the 2nd week of September, one that had come up lame enough in the near foreleg that it wasn't worth carrying through winter. It was ranch work like any other. Hide off, quarters hung, the parts men expected to eat set aside, and the rest left for whoever wanted the trouble of it. Nobody wanted the trouble of it. The heart, the liver, the tongue, the sweetbreads, a length of marrow gut still soft with tallow. Rafe had them stacked on a burlap sack near the smokehouse, ready to go wherever such things went on this ranch, which so far had generally meant the dogs or the ground. Hannah looked at the pile a long moment before she said anything. "I'll take that." Rafe looked at her, then at the sack, like he was checking whether she understood what she was asking for. "That's innards, ma'am." "I know what it is." She'd learned the dish in Rollins from a Texas man who'd cooked it on a dozen dries before his knees gave out and put him behind a boarding house stove instead. A stew built from everything a green cowhand would throw away and everything an old one wouldn't. Heart and tongue diced small, liver browned quick so it didn't turn bitter, marrow gut for the richness a cut of muscle meat couldn't give a pot, all of it simmered slow with onion and what pepper the tin could spare. Son of a bitch stew, he'd called it, and hadn't offered to explain the name, and she hadn't asked. She'd made it exactly once before, for that same Texas man, on a night he was too sick to cook it himself. He'd eaten the whole bowl without a word, and never once mentioned it again, which she'd understood even then to be the highest thing he was going to say about it. She built the fire up that evening and set to it alone, and didn't tell anyone what was in the pot. Word got round the bunkhouse before supper, the way word did on a ranch that size. Somebody had seen the sack go into the kitchen instead of out to the dogs, and by the time the men came in off evening chores, there was a particular quiet hanging over the table. The kind of quiet men wore when they'd already decided what they thought and were only waiting to be proven right. She ladled it out without comment. Thick, dark, the marrow risen to a sheen across the top, steam carrying the smell of it down the length of the table. Nobody moved first. Rafe was the one who finally picked up his spoon. Not because he wanted to, Hannah judged, but because somebody had to, and he'd been the loudest voice against her coffee back in July, and there was a particular kind of man who couldn't let another man be first to try something he'd already decided to scorn. He took a spoonful, held it a second before he ate it, the way a man does when he's braced for something. He didn't say anything. He ate the rest of the bowl in the same silence, steady, unhurried, and when it was empty, he didn't push it away and didn't ask for seconds either. He simply stood, walked it to the stove himself, and ladled it full again without a word to anyone, and came back and sat down and finished that one too. Nobody remarked on it. Down the table, the other plates emptied at their own pace, spoons scraping, nothing said that wasn't about the haying or the weather or whose turn it was on first watch. It might have been any other supper on any other evening. If a man hadn't just eaten 2 full bowls of a dish he'd have called garbage a season earlier, and never once opened his mouth to admit it. Sigrid, clearing plates later, paused at Rafe's empty bowl a moment before she carried it off, and said nothing about that either. Corwin came in late, after the men had already gone back out to the bunkhouse, and found the pot scraped down to a thin film at the bottom, barely enough left for a single bowl. He looked at it and at Hannah, who was already elbow-deep in wash water and hadn't turned around. What was it? Offcuts, nothing that would have kept. He didn't ask further. He found a bowl, filled it with what was left, and ate standing at the counter the way he did most nights when the kitchen had already closed around him, and didn't say whether he liked it, and didn't need to. He set the empty bowl in the wash basin himself when he was done, something he'd never once done before in all the weeks she'd been in that kitchen, and went on out to check the horses before dark. The shipping crew rode out the second week of October, 10 days of gathering and driving that thinned the bunkhouse down to a handful of names overnight. By the time the last of the dust from the trail herd had settled behind them, the ranch that had fed 10 men twice a day for 2 months was down to 4. Corwin, Rafe, and 2 others kept on through the slow months to see to the stock and the fences until spring. Nobody said anything to Hannah about what that meant. Nobody had to. She could count as well as anyone, and a house feeding 4 didn't need a cook at all. Sigrid had managed a table of 4 alone for years before Hannah ever walked up that wagon road, and could manage it again without strain, now that the worst of the season's work had passed. Hannah went on with the mornings the same as always. Fire built, bread started, the cellar checked before breakfast and again before dark. The 2 vent lids swung open or shut depending on which way the wind had turned overnight. Nobody had asked her to keep at it. She kept at it anyway, the way a person tends a thing out of habit, even after they've stopped being sure it's still theirs to tend. One morning in late October, she came up from the cellar to find frost heavy on the yard, the first hard one of the year, grass gone white and stiff underfoot, and stood a moment at the top of the steps with her hand still on the door latch, looking at it. Nobody was there to see her stand like that. She went in and started the fire, same as any other day. She missed a night in November. A sudden warm wind came up out of nowhere after supper, the kind that shouldn't have mattered in a season already turning toward winter. And by the time she remembered the vents and went down to check them, the low pipe had been drawing warm outside air in for hours instead of cold, and a full bin of potatoes near the intake had gone soft with the sudden damp, ruined past any saving. She didn't try to hide it. She found Corwin at the barn the next morning and told him plainly what had happened and what it had cost. and didn't offer an excuse for why she'd let a night slip. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting. "1 bin," he said when she'd finished. "Out of how many you've kept through all of it besides? Still, a bin you paid for. I've lost worse to less warning than a warm wind." He looked at her a moment. "You tell me the next time something goes wrong, same as you told me this one. That's the whole of what I'm asking." He didn't say anything else about it, and neither did she, and she went back to checking the vents twice a day, same as before, more carefully than she had until then. She heard him and Rafe talking once, out past the corral where they didn't know the kitchen window carried sound on a still evening. "Cellar's held better this fall than it has in 10 years I've worked here," Rafe was saying. "Amos never got it to keep past January without losing a third of it." "I know it. Winter crew's small enough Sigrid could see to feeding it herself comes to that. I know that too." Neither of them said anything further, and Hannah moved away from the window before either man could think to look toward it, and went back to kneading a batch of bread she didn't especially need to be kneading right then. Fall settle-up fell on the last Saturday of October, same as it did every year Corwin had run the place, the day the cattle money came back from the shipping point and every account at Meacham's got squared at once, credit against what the season had actually cost. Hannah rode into Fenner with him in the wagon, though she hadn't been asked along and hadn't asked to come. Corwin hadn't said why, and she hadn't asked that either. Meacham had the ledger open on the counter before they'd got their coats off, a heavy book with a column for the Sayers account running down half a page in his own cramped hand. Flour, coffee, salt, sugar, the small, steady weight of what a ranch spent to feed itself through a season. He ran his finger down the entries from spring, comparing them, muttering the sums under his breath the way he did with every account that came through his door twice a year. His finger stopped partway down. He looked up, not at Corwin, but past him, at Hannah standing by the stove with her hands folded in front of her like she had somewhere else to be. He didn't say anything. He looked back down at the column, turned back a page to check the spring numbers again, then forward to the fall ones, then closed the ledger over his own finger to hold the place, and looked at Corwin instead. "Same crew size as last year?" "Bigger, through hang in the drive. 10 most of the summer." Meacham opened the ledger again. He didn't say what he'd found. He didn't have to. He simply turned it around on the counter so Corwin could see the column himself and waited. Corwin looked at it a long moment. Hannah didn't look at all. She was watching a crack in the floorboards near her boot and didn't need to see the number to know roughly the shape of it. She'd been keeping her own private reckoning in her head for 2 months, out of habit. The same habit that had her checking cellar vents nobody had asked her to check. Nobody in that store said the number out loud. Meacham reached for his pen to close the account, same as he did every settle-up, and held it a moment over the page before he set it down again and pushed the ledger a few inches toward Corwin instead. An old, unspoken rule between the two men that the rancher signed his own account closed. Corwin picked up the pen. He got as far as dipping it, the way he had every October for 15 years running, and then he stopped and looked at it in his hand a moment like he wasn't sure anymore whose signature belonged on that line. He turned and held the pen out to Hannah. "Write it." She looked at the pen and at him and didn't ask why. She took it and signed the account closed in a hand steadier than the moment probably called for, and Meacham took the ledger back without comment and set it on the shelf with the others. Done for another season. Nobody in the store said another word about it. Corwin settled the rest of his business, a length of stovepipe, a paper of needles for Sigrid, a stick of peppermint candy he bought without explanation and put in his coat pocket, and they loaded the wagon and started back before the light went. The first real snow came 3 days later. Not the kind that melted off by noon, but the kind that meant business, settling thick and quiet over the yard overnight, and still coming down soft when Hannah went out before breakfast to see to the cellar. Nell followed her out across the yard in a coat 2 sizes too big, boots crunching in snow not yet packed down by any other footprints, carrying the small clay jar in both hands the way a person carries something that took a long time to keep alive. Sigrid had helped her start it herself a week back. Flour and water in a jar of her own, set warm near the stove, same as Hannah's, fed a little each morning until it had a life of its own going. It sat now on the shelf in Nell's room, and she'd taken to bringing it down to the kitchen each morning to feed alongside Hannah's, the two jars side by side on the same warm shelf. Hannah pulled open the low vent first, checked the draw with her palm the way she'd done every morning for 2 months, then reached up and swung the high one shut against the coming cold. The winter setting now, both lids closed tight until the ground froze hard enough to hold steady without help. Nell watched the whole of it without asking why, the way she'd stopped asking why about most things in that kitchen, having learned there was usually a reason even when nobody explained it. Is it going to snow all the way till spring now? Some of it will melt off, most of it won't. Mel considered that, satisfied enough with the answer, and held her jar a little tighter against the cold air coming up out of the cellar door. They walked back up to the house together, 2 sets of boot prints in fresh snow, smoke standing straight and steady off the kitchen chimney ahead of them, and neither one said anything else the rest of the way in.